Every Fallout game throws you into the boots of someone different. A vault dweller, a courier, a soldier, a parent searching for their kid, and you spend hours shaping who they become. But here's the thing almost nobody talks about. Before you ever pick up that controller, before you fire a single shot at a raider or pet a two-headed cow, these characters already had lives, real backstory, real names, real reasons for being thrown into the wasteland in the first place. And honestly, some of these origins are way darker and more interesting than the games actually let on. So today we're diving into the origins of every Fallout protagonist, from the very first vault dweller all the way to the newest faces in the franchise. And trust me, by the end of this, you're going to look at these characters completely differently. Let's get into it. Vault 13's hero. We have to start where it all began, with the absolute legend that kicked off the entire franchise, the vault dweller from the original Fallout. Now this guy, or girl, depending on how you played, came out of Vault 13, and Vault 13 was supposed to be one of the good vaults. You know, one of the ones that wasn't secretly running horrifying experiments on its residents. It was just supposed to seal up, keep people safe, and ride out the apocalypse like a long underground vacation with bad lighting. Yeah, that worked out great. The Vault Dweller was born sometime in the 2014 S inside Vault 13, somewhere in Southern California. Their entire life up until the start of the game was spent underground. They never saw the sun. They never breathed real air. They probably thought a Brahmin was a myth. And then, one day in 2016, the water chip broke. For those of you who don't know, the water chip is basically the thing keeping the vault from turning into a giant tomb. No water chip, no water. No water, everyone dies in about 150 days. Pretty rough deadline, if you ask me. So the Overseer, who I genuinely think is one of the worst bosses in gaming history, picks the Vault Dweller out of the population to go find a replacement. Just throw them out the door with a Pip-Boy and a good luck buddy. No survival training, no real weapons, nothing. And this random Vault kid actually does it. They find the chip, they take down the Master, they blow up the Mariposa military base, and they save humanity from getting turned into a super mutant smoothie. You'd think they'd get a hero's welcome, right? Well, you'd be wrong. The Overseer exiles them. Just kicks them out for being too changed by the wasteland. That's the thanks you get for saving everyone. The Vault Dweller wanders off into the desert and eventually finds the village of Arroyo, which becomes pretty important for our next protagonist on this list, Tribal Bloodline. Speaking of Arroyo, let's talk about the Chosen One, because this guy might have the wildest family tree in the entire franchise. The Chosen One is the direct descendant of the Vault Dweller, like a grandkid level direct. They were born and raised in Arroyo, which by the time Fallout 2 rolls around in 2024 is this small tribal village struggling to survive in the wasteland. So picture this. Your grandparents saved the world, became a legend, then got booted from their home and had to start a tribe in the middle of nowhere. Now 80 years later, the village is dying. The crops won't grow, people are starving. And the village elder, who is also your aunt by the way because lore is fun, tells you that you're the Chosen One and you need to go find a Garden of Eden creation kit to save everyone. A GECK for short, which is honestly one of the funniest acronyms in the franchise. The Chosen One starts the game in a loincloth with a spear. That's it. That's your starting equipment. Meanwhile, by the end of the game, you're flying a vertibird and assaulting an oil rig full of Enclave soldiers in power armor. The progression is insane. But here's the part that gets glossed over. The Chosen One isn't just some random tribal warrior. They've got Vault Dweller DNA running through their veins, which back then actually mattered. The Enclave was hunting people with pure pre-war genetics so they could test their modified FEV virus on populations that had been mutated by radiation. The Chosen One was basically immune to the thing the Enclave was using to wipe out everyone else. So yeah, your aunt sends you out with a stick and a dream, and you end up being the one person genetically capable of stopping a fascist government from genociding the entire wasteland. Just another Tuesday in Fallout. And speaking of protagonists nobody talks about, let's swing over to the one most fans actively try to forget exists, Midwest. Soldier. Alright, quick stop here because Fallout Tactics is a weird one, and I know some of you forgot it existed. I almost did too. The warrior is the protagonist of Fallout Tactics, and they're a bit different because they're not really one specific character. They're a Brotherhood of Steel initiate, somewhere in the Midwest around 2197. Their backstory is basically that they got recruited or born into the Midwestern chapter of the Brotherhood, which split off from the main California group after a vertibird crashed in Chicago. This whole branch of the Brotherhood is way more open to outsiders than the original, which means they actually let mutants and ghouls join their ranks. Pretty progressive for a faction that usually shoots anything that looks weird at it. The warrior doesn't get the same emotional setup as other protagonists. There's no dead wife, no missing kid, no dying village. They're just a soldier with a job to do, and that job is hunting down the remnants of a calculator AI that's trying to wipe out humanity. Honestly, the lore here is so disconnected from the main games that Bethesda kind of pretends it doesn't count. But the warrior is still technically a Fallout protagonist, so they get a spot on this list. Sorry, not sorry. But once we leave that forgotten chapter behind, Fallout finally hits the mainstream with the protagonist that introduced an entire generation to the wasteland. Daddy issues. Okay, now we're getting into the good stuff. The Lone Wanderer is where Fallout went from cult classic series to absolute absolute mainstream giant, and honestly, the origin story for this one is pretty fantastic. The Lone Wanderer was born on July 13th, 2025, inside Vault 101 in the Capital Wasteland. And right from the jump, this character is special, because the game actually lets you play through their birth. Yeah, you literally start the game as a baby. Your dad, voiced by Liam Neeson because Bethesda had money to burn, is right there delivering you while your mom dies in childbirth. Talk about a rough first day on the job. You grow up in Vault 101, which is supposed to be one of those vaults that never opens. The Overseer is obsessed with keeping the vault sealed forever, even after the radiation outside dropped to safe levels. So everyone inside thinks the surface is a death zone full of monsters and acid rain. The Lone Wanderer's whole childhood is spent inside this concrete tube. You celebrate your 10th birthday and get a Pip-Boy. You take the GOAT test at 16, which decides what your job will be for the rest of your life. Genuinely the most stressful career counseling session ever made. Then one day, your dad just leaves, walks right out the vault door without telling anyone. The Overseer goes nuclear, sends security after you, and you have to escape into a wasteland you've literally never seen before. The thing that makes this origin so good is that the Lone Wanderer isn't some hardened survivor. They're a kid who grew up reading books about the surface and then got thrown into it with nothing but a 10mm pistol and questionable parenting. Everything that happens after, all the monsters, the radiation, the Enclave, the super mutants, all of that is brand new to them. And the reason their dad left? He was trying to finish Project Purity, the water purifier that was supposed to give the entire Capital Wasteland clean drinking water. The Lone Wanderer ends up finishing that project for him, sometimes at the cost of their own life, depending on how you played the ending. Also fun fact, the Lone Wanderer's mother, Catherine, was obsessed with a Bible passage about the water of life, and she quoted it right before she died. So even before they were born, this character was tied to the whole clean water mission. That's some next level foreshadowing right there. Now from a kid who never set foot outside, we move to a protagonist who literally got shot in the head before the game even started. Shot in head. Alright, the Courier. The fan favorite, the character everyone has strong opinions about, the Courier is fascinating because Obsidian deliberately gave them almost no backstory. We don't know where they were born, we don't know their family, we don't know their real name. All we know is they were a delivery person for the Mojave Express, and they got hired to deliver a platinum chip to the New Vegas Strip. Then Benny shot them in the head and buried them in a shallow grave. Pretty rough Tuesday. The Courier survives, gets dug up by a robot named Victor, patched up by a doctor named Mitchell, and the entire game is built around them figuring out who shot them and why, which is honestly a way better setup than Find Your Dad, if I'm being real. Here's where it gets interesting though. The DLC actually fills in a lot of the Courier's hidden background. Through Lonesome Road, we learn that the Courier used to travel through a place called the Divide before it got nuked. They unknowingly carried a package that contained the trigger for a bunch of dormant nuclear missiles, and that's why a guy named Ulysses spends the entire DLC trying to murder them. So the Courier accidentally caused a second mini-apocalypse, just by doing their job. That's wild. We also know from Old World Blues that the Courier's been to Big Mountain before, and the scientists there knew them well enough to remember their face. So this character has been all over the place doing absolutely insane things long before the events of New Vegas. The cool part is that the Courier feels like a fully realized person who existed before the game started. They have history, they have enemies who remember them, they have reputations in places you've never been, and the game just trusts you to fill in the rest. I think this is genuinely one of the best protagonist origins in the series specifically because it doesn't hand everything to you. You get to be a person with a past, and that past slowly reveals itself the more you explore. It was a pain replaying every DLC just to piece this all together for the video, but I hate myself so I did it. But if the Courier is the protagonist with the most mysterious past, this next one is the exact opposite. They actually remember the world before the bombs fell. Frozen parent. Now we get to the sole survivor, and this one is actually pretty unique because it's the only playable protagonist in the entire franchise who was alive before the bombs dropped. Let that sink in for a second. The sole survivor remembers a world with cars, with electricity, with grocery stores, with baseball. They lived through the actual America that everyone else in Fallout only knows from holotapes and ruined billboards. Depending on which version you play, the sole survivor was either a military veteran who served in the Anchorage Reclamation or a lawyer who worked on civilian cases. They lived in Sanctuary Hills, a suburban neighborhood just north of Boston, with their spouse Nate, or Nora, and their infant son Sean. Then on October 23, 2077, the bombs fell. The family ran to Vault 111, got cryogenically frozen without being told what was happening, and woke up over 200 years later to find their spouse murdered and their baby missing. Talk about a bad morning. The sole survivor's entire motivation is finding their son, and the twist that the game pulls is genuinely brutal. By the time you find Sean, he's an old man. He's the leader of the Institute. He's been alive for 60 years while you were on ice. and he's actively been running the faction that's been kidnapping and replacing people across the Commonwealth. Imagine looking for your baby for an entire game and finding out he's older than you and also kind of evil. That's a therapy bill nobody can afford. What I find genuinely interesting about this origin is that the sole survivor knows exactly what was lost. They actually grieve for the world in a way nobody else can. Every other character grew up in the wasteland or in a vault that was completely cut off from history. That's also why a lot of people criticize this protagonist. Because the game forces them into a specific role as a parent and spouse, your role-playing options are kind of limited. You can't really play as someone who doesn't care about their family because the entire main quest depends on you caring. But the origin itself, genuinely one of the most tragic in the series. Speaking of tragic, the next protagonist walked out of their vault expecting to rebuild America and instead found a literal plague waiting for them. Reclamation Day. Fallout 76 has a different kind of protagonist setup, and it took me a minute to wrap my head around it the first time I played. The Vault 76 dweller, sometimes just called the Resident, was born sometime before the Great War and grew up inside Vault 76 in the hills of West Virginia. Vault 76 was actually one of the control vaults, meaning it wasn't designed to run horrifying experiments on its residents. It was supposed to open after 25 years and let everyone out to rebuild America. So, unlike pretty much every other Vault dweller, this character actually had a relatively normal upbringing. They were trained to be pioneers. They were taught how to rebuild society. They were given pep talks and patriotic speeches and probably way too much synthetic apple pie. On October 27, 2102, exactly 25 years after the bombs fell, Vault 76 opens on Reclamation Day. The Resident steps outside as part of the first wave of dwellers tasked with restoring civilization in Appalachia, and immediately everything goes wrong. The Overseer left ahead of them. The wasteland is full of horrifying creatures called Scorched, which are humans transformed by something called the Scorched Plague. There's a giant flying monster called the Scorch Beast Queen lurking deep underground in the mines, and oh yeah, basically every other settlement of survivors in the region had already been wiped out by the time the vault opened. The Residents' whole origin is that they were prepared for everything except what they actually found. They were trained to plant crops and rebuild towns, and they ended up fighting a literal apocalypse-level pandemic with nothing but a baseball bat and friendship. Honestly, the more I look at this protagonist, the more I respect them. They had every reason to just run back into the vault and never come out, and instead they stuck around and rebuilt Appalachia from nothing. That takes some serious stones. Now we leave the games behind and step into the show because the TV protagonists are fully canon, and their origins might be the most brutal of the bunch. The Aspirant. Alright, now we move to the show because the Fallout TV protagonists are actually canon to the games, which is something that still surprises me every time I remember it. Let's start with Maximus, who has one of the more tragic origins in the entire franchise. When Maximus was a kid, he survived the nuclear destruction of Shady Sands, the blast that wiped the entire NCR capital off the map. His parents died in the fallout that followed. He survived, wandered the wasteland alone as an orphan, and was eventually picked up by the Brotherhood of Steel and raised inside their walls. The Brotherhood took him in, raised him as a squire, and trained him to be a soldier. By the time we meet him in the show, he's an aspirant trying desperately to become a full knight. The thing is, Maximus isn't really a true believer. He doesn't love the Brotherhood the way other recruits do. He just wanted a family, and they were the closest thing to one he could find. What makes his origin so good is that the show doesn't shy away from how brutal his upbringing was. The Brotherhood beats him, abuses him, makes him bow to higher-ranking knights, and treats him like absolute trash for most of his early life. He climbs the ranks not because he believes in the mission, but because he has nowhere else to go. Then he gets his shot at power armor by basically letting a knight die, which is genuinely one of the more morally gray decisions any Fallout protagonist has made on screen. And from there, he stumbles into the larger plot of the show, including the discovery of cold fusion technology that could change the wasteland forever. Maximus is interesting because he's not really a hero in the traditional sense. He lies, he kills, he makes selfish choices, but he also genuinely wants to do the right thing when he can figure out what that is. That's a way more realistic origin than most of the games give you, but Maximus isn't even the main character of the show. That title belongs to a vault dweller whose entire family is hiding a secret so dark it rewrites everything we thought we knew about the wasteland. Wedding gone wrong. Lucy is probably the closest thing the Fallout TV show has to a traditional protagonist, and her origin is wild. Lucy was born and raised in Vault 33, somewhere in California. Her father Hank is the Overseer, and the vault has this whole rotating leadership system where the 3 connected vaults swap residents every few years to prevent inbreeding. Pretty practical solution, kind of dystopian, classic vault tech. Lucy grows up thinking she has a totally normal vault life. Her mom died when she was little. Her dad raised her and her brother Norm. She studies hard, follows the rules, and is genuinely a good person, in a way that's almost shocking compared to most Wasteland characters. Then, her wedding day happens, and that's where everything falls apart. Raiders attack the vault, kidnap her dad, and Lucy has to leave Vault 33 for the first time in her life to go find him. The first 10 minutes she's outside are basically a slapstick comedy of her getting attacked by everything in the Wasteland, and honestly, it's some of the best protagonist introduction work the franchise has ever done. But here's where her origin gets dark. Throughout the show, Lucy slowly figures out that her family isn't what she thought. Her mom didn't die naturally. Her dad has been hiding massive secrets, and the vault she grew up in is connected to the destruction of an entire surface settlement called Shady Sands. By the end of Season 1, Lucy learns that her father literally nuked Shady Sands, killing thousands of people, including basically erasing the new California Republic from the map. Her whole identity gets shredded, and she has to figure out who she is when the family she trusted turns out to be monsters. That's a way heavier origin than Find a Water Chip, if you ask me. But even Lucy's family drama can't compete with the protagonist, who has been alive since before the bombs even dropped, and his backstory is the darkest of the entire franchise. Copper Howard. And now we have to talk about the ghoul who has the longest backstory of any protagonist on this list, because the dude has been alive for over 200 years. Cooper Howard was a famous Hollywood actor before the Great War. He starred in a bunch of westerns. He was basically the Clint Eastwood of his era. He had a wife named Barb, a daughter named Janie, and a comfortable life in Los Angeles. Then his wife got hired by Vault Tech. This is where it gets brutal. Barb wasn't just an employee. She was a high-ranking executive at Vault Tech who was actively involved in the planning of the Great War. She was part of the meeting where Vault Tech executives discussed dropping the bombs themselves so they could control the rebuilding of America. Cooper finds out about this, confronts her, and his whole world falls apart. When the bombs drop, Cooper is at his daughter's birthday party. He grabs Janie and runs, and somewhere in the chaos he gets exposed to enough radiation to slowly turn him into a ghoul over time. He survives, but he loses his daughter along the way, and he spends the next 2 centuries searching for her. 2 centuries. Let that number actually sink in. The ghoul has been alive longer than most countries have existed. He's seen the rise and fall of multiple wasteland civilizations. He's killed more people than any other Fallout protagonist by an absolutely insane margin. And the entire time, he's just been looking for his daughter. The reason he stays alive and stays sane is that he keeps taking a drug that prevents ghouls from going feral. Without it, he loses his mind permanently and becomes one of the mindless monsters everyone hates. So, on top of the centuries of trauma, he's also a junkie who has to constantly hunt for his next dose. Real fun retirement plan. Cooper Howard's origin is honestly the best one in the entire franchise in my opinion, because it ties together the pre-war world, the Vault Tech conspiracy, the formation of ghouls, and the personal cost of survival all into one character. He's the bridge between everything Fallout has ever been about, and he didn't even appear until the show came out. So with all these origins laid out side by side, you start to notice something pretty interesting. Every single one of these characters shares the exact same wound, one common thread. So here's what I find genuinely interesting after going through all of these. Every single Fallout protagonist, whether they're a vault dweller or a tribal warrior or a frozen suburbanite or a 200-year-old ghoul, gets defined by the same basic thing. They all start as someone's family member, and they all lose that family in some way. The vault dweller leaves their home and gets exiled. The chosen one's entire village is dying. The lone wanderer's dad disappears. The sole survivor watches their spouse die and their baby gets stolen. The resident leaves behind everyone they ever knew. Lucy's family turns out to be monsters. Cooper Howard loses his wife to corporate evil and his daughter to nuclear fire. Family is the one universal thread, and it makes sense when you think about why. Fallout is a series about civilization collapsing, and the smallest unit of civilization is family. Every protagonist's origin is basically asking the same question. What happens to a person when the structure that defined them gets ripped away? The answer is usually either they become a hero, they become a monster, or some combination of both. And the games trust you to figure out which one you want to be. That's also why these origins matter so much. You're not just rolling a random character in a vacuum. You're stepping into a life that already had meaning, that already had loss, and that already had a reason to keep moving forward when everything else fell apart. Final thoughts. If you'd asked me before making this video which Fallout protagonist had the best origin, I would have said the Courier without hesitation. The mystery the DLC reveals. The fact that you get to fill in the gaps yourself. All of it just clicks. But after going back through every single one of these, I think the answer is actually Cooper Howard. Not because his story is the most dramatic, although it absolutely is, but because he's the only protagonist whose origin spans the entire timeline of the franchise. He saw the world before it ended. He saw it end. He saw what came after, and he's still out there, surviving, still looking for his daughter, still high on the drug that keeps him from going feral. That's not just a character origin. That's the entire story of Fallout compressed into one guy with a cowboy hat and no nose. The wasteland breaks people. That's the whole point. But every once in a while, it produces someone who refuses to break. And those are the protagonists we follow. The names change, the settings change, the apocalypse just keeps grinding away. But the heart of every Fallout protagonist is the same. They lose everything, and they decide to keep going anyway. That's what makes them worth playing. And that's why people are still talking about these characters decades after some of them first appeared. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the most disturbing countries in Fallout Iceberg, click the video on your screen.